Brandon.
Hey, thank you. Welcome. Peace.
Just give me a minute, y'all. It's getting it ready for the live broadcast. All right. Well, we're good to go. So thank you again for being on this conversation. I admire each of you. The work that you do is so impactful. Your spirit, your energy, your essence is what everybody needs right now. So I just want to say thank you, all of you, for being here. So I don't want to waste any time. I know we only have an hour to talk with these amazing folks. So the first question I want to ask Dr. Clark, if you can get started, and then we can feel free to chime in after that, but just tell us a little bit about yourself and why Black mental health is important to you.
So my name is DeMarcus Clark. I am the program director and tenured faculty and program director of the Marriage and Family Therapy program at Seton Hill University and tenured faculty there. I'm also the owner of the Center for Relational Change, which is a group practice here in the Pittsburgh area, and I have practice. So Black mental health is extremely important to me, mainly because it is the thing that keeps me motivated and driven to make a difference in this world. Understanding the impact that systemic racism has on Black people due to 250 plus years of slavery, 100 years of Jim Crow, plus decades of oppression and dehumanization by white supremacy in this country. Knowing and understanding that I have a skill set that can help Black folks heal and understand the impact of systemic racism and help white folks understand their privilege and fragility feeds my spirit. So those are just some of the reasons that Black mental health is important to me.
Thank you. Dr. Logan?
Yes, welcome. Glad to be here. Not to repeat Dr. Clark, similar kinds of issues. The other thing is I've taken on the responsibility to continue the resilience and survival legacy of our ancestors. It's amazing how they survived enslavement and multi-generational trauma. So the work I'm doing is because I'm standing on their shoulders. If they did not survive that craziness, I would not be here. So I owe them a debt of gratitude for what they went through, and also to transform the traumatization and the pain and the rage that we carry individually and collectively. I think what we miss sometimes is looking at not only our individual traumas, like these micro and major aggressions that we experience, but our collective trauma that has been unaddressed. People talk about reparations. I also use the synonym repair. We have not had a chance to repair ourselves, to integrate all these emotional traumas that we've been carrying for centuries. So that's a major reason why I do what I do. And I'll talk about more of that later. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Logan. Brother Brandon?
Today I was having a conversation with someone who was asking, like, how can they tune in? And one of the things I mentioned was one of the solutions I see to a lot of the world's problem is everyone having access to a qualified mental health professional, right? Without anything getting in the way of it, particularly Black and brown people, and for me, particularly young children. I do believe if we can catch young children early on, mitigate any delays that might be, or traumas that have occurred, if we could help them, say like Brother Logan said, repair, heal, and also understanding that that's an ongoing process. It's not a destination from my perspective, right? And so that they can continue to evolve no matter what happens. I believe the world would be a much better place. And, I told this person, I said, if I ever run for some kind of office, not that I'm trying to do that, I would make that a point of running. Like, why not? It's a birthright. And so I don't know that we often have that kind of dialogue, like, hey, it's okay for you to go see a mental health professional, particularly one that maybe, looks like you. I don't know that folks are hearing that. And so carrying that message on so that, all human beings can feel, like they can have a chance to have hope.
Thank you, brother. Dr. Plummer?
Hello, good evening. As always, I'm so excited to be here with you, Julius, and I love the work that you're doing. So my name is Dr. Plummer. I am the CEO of Onyx Therapy Group, and we are headquartered in Washington, D.C. We have 8 offices in 3 different states, including the city of Pittsburgh, rather. So I'm excited that we are doing some work out that way also. I'm also faculty at Johns Hopkins University, and I love the work that I'm doing there. So your question, why is Black mental health important to me? And I think it's because it's so personal for me, right? Black mental health is me. It's my family. It's my children. It's my community. It's my next door neighbors. It's their friends down the street. It's who I'm interacting with on a regular basis. It's the reflection, right? Like when I see a Black person, I'm wondering, are you well, right? And that's because I want them to feel that sense of community and feel that sense of love. And I also believe that Black mental health is important to me because it's part of my purpose. I believe that I am a healer, like Dr. Clark said. There's healing in this work, and there's a repair in this work that needs to be done. And I believe that my ancestors chose me to come onto the earth at this time to be a healer, right? And it would be against my walk and against my purpose to do anything other than that. They made me sensitive to Black mental health. They made me sensitive to cultural intersections. They made me sensitive to racial traumas. And because of that sensitivity, I've been able to get the education that I need in order to provide more healing for my people, right? So for me, Black mental health is important because it's a reflection of who I am, and it's a reflection of the purpose and why I've been put on this earth.
Thank you.
Can I say something?
Please.
When Dr. Plummer was talking, it just reminded me, when I was talking to a friend recently, I was watching one of the multitude of things that's going on, and I was crying uncontrollably. And it made me realize that my tears weren't just about me, and they were bigger than me. My tears were about my ancestors too. So it made me realize that, like Dr. Plummer said, some of the work that I'm doing and my passion and drive isn't just mine, it's about my ancestors as well. And I just wanted to add that because that feels important in acknowledging what we're talking about.
Yeah, because we're here to break cycles too, right? Like they placed us here at a particular time for a particular reason and chose us. And part of our Black mental health and wellness is to break certain cycles, and it's to help our clients increase their awareness so that they could break individual family cycles, but all together collectively, we get to break some other cycles as well. So sorry, Julius, I get excited, brother. I get excited. Let me mute myself.
Listen, if y'all need to chime in and add something, Dr. Logan, I see you're coming off mute.
Yeah. I want to honor Dr. Clark for doing something to break a cycle. When I grew up, we all had to act like we had our act together. Our comment was, I'm cool, I got everything together. What you just demonstrated, Dr. Clark, was the importance of being vulnerable. For example, admitting that you cried. A lot of men, we get the message when we grow up, a lot of boys don't cry. Big boys don't cry. Buck up, stuff it. That's one of the major healing processes, to own our vulnerability. First of all, to identify that we're feeling vulnerable and to own it and speak to it, because you can draw the information from those feelings. Our feelings contain information.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't touch it and own it, you can't process it. So I just want to honor what you just demonstrated to, especially the Black men or men in general. Our culture conditions us to avoid how we feel.
Mm-hmm.
So I just want to make note of that.
Thank you. And I'm just sorry, Julie. I just want to add one more thing. Healing,
I'm not here. Just pretend I'm not here.
healing can't happen unless we create a space within ourselves to be vulnerable. I just want to repeat that. Healing cannot happen. We cannot get to healing unless we're open enough to be vulnerable. Vulnerability is one of the most powerful things on this earth. And until we're able to see that, own that, and deal with that and acknowledge that, we will continue to be stuck in the spaces of trauma. I'm going to shut up for a second now.
I think, and I also would say that I believe it's extra important that we, to some degree, share those vulnerabilities. I know Julius invited me to talk a few weeks ago to a peer group he has set up in the South. And I asked him, like, bro, is it cool for me to just talk to them about some of my lived experience, particularly grief and loss of people that were very close to me, my cousins. And, you know, he said, yeah, man, go ahead and do it. And so I believe that was the catalyst for me having a successful hour with them. I believe if I hadn't led with that, we may not have connected as we did in that way.
I'm glad you shared that. If we don't talk about what we've been through at a level of authenticity and vulnerability, we will not be able to connect the dots within our generation and the generations preceding us. One of the biggest favors my maternal grandmother did for me and my siblings is to describe some of her experiences as a child, the pain she suffered, the pain I think my great-grandmother suffered, passed her pain to my grandmother. And I'm here today because my grandmother stopped that process. My mother died when I was 5, and 2 years after that, my father remarried too soon. I don't think he resolved his trauma with my mother's death and whatever else he went through as a young guy. And he turned into a domestic abuser of my stepmother. She in turn passed her emotional abuse on to me and my sister, and physical abuse to me and my sister. So we were abused emotionally. What we don't recognize is how that emotional stream gets passed from generation to generation to generation. And I try to understand part of my family history by talking to my paternal aunt. She would not talk about family history. So I consequently could not connect the dots between my father's rage and how that affected me as a child. So I couldn't process that because I didn't have the information. And I think that's where we lose out a lot of the times. I know it's painful to talk about trauma. However, when we don't know our family history and what our relationship with our parents is like, and what they experienced with their parents, and then in turn, what the grandparents passed on to the parents. Because what I've understood about family systems is that to understand your relationship with your parent, it's important to understand the relationship between the parent and the grandparent. So, I mean, that's extremely important as I understand it.
I think that's a perfect statement, Dr. Logan. It makes me think about how so many of our clients, prior to coming into therapy, they're really afraid to sit in front of us and start talking about details, right? They get really afraid of maybe the vulnerability or airing dirty laundry or, you know, exposing things that they have been taught and conditioned to hide. And so for those clients, I also say to them, you know, you don't have to sit here in this moment when you're first meeting me or after a couple months and telling me everything. Sometimes you need to just sit with me. Sometimes we need to just have a little bit of therapeutic silence, because let me tell you, even if you don't have all the details because nobody has actually spoken to them, your ancestors will speak to you. And sometimes you need to just sit down and you need to slow down, because there's messages that we're constantly being told and we're moving so fast that we're not paying attention to them. And that's not really a matter of like particular religion, right? Because as Black people, we understand our connections to this earth. We understand our connections to this universe. But sometimes what I find is that it's really helpful for clients to know that eventually we're going to talk about some things. But at some point, it's okay to just sit here. It's okay to just be silent. It's okay to just cry. Because when we sit in silence, that's when things start to bubble up. We're good at working, right? Like our ancestors are workers. We're workers. We're good at producing things. And so we use that busyness as a matter of avoidance too. And sometimes when we sit still, the things will start to expose themselves anyway. And we'll get messages that we don't even know where they're coming from. Who is speaking to you in this moment and how are they speaking to you? What is it that they're trying to show you? And here I am with you in this moment, creating safety with you for you to tell me what's coming up. after a bout of silence.
Thank you. That's extremely important. As people of African descent, our legacy is understanding multiple dimensions. There are more dimensions than the one that we see in this physical, quote, reality. And that's one of the other things that my grandmother passed on to me and my siblings. She taught us about other dimensional beings. So some people may not realize that, you know, the blindness that sometimes science puts on our eyes, that we don't understand that if you can't touch it, weigh it, if it's not material, it doesn't exist. Our African heritage, as you allude to, has to do with, we are accompanied by spiritual allies, either ancestors or other spiritual beings who are here to guide us through this lifetime. You know, Christianity talks about Jesus, for example, or the Easterners talk about Buddha, for example. So there are actual beings on other dimensions. The rules work differently on those dimensions, but they're real. So thank you. I appreciate you bringing that up, Dr. Plummer.
You're welcome.
Okay. You know, one of the things I know when my ancestors pull my coat, I start crying, like Dr. Croc. I cry when I sense the presence of my ancestors. So that's the way they let me know they're here with me. So, and I'm okay crying. I've cried a lot in public, so, and I'm okay with that.
Thank you all for all those reflections. So when we talk about racial trauma, we've been talking about it for a little bit in this conversation. There's a lot of different ways that people are describing it and referencing it. So I think it's important for us to have some sort of definition or perspective, vantage point. So I'm just interested in hearing from you all. How are you defining racial trauma for yourself and for some of the clients and community members you're working with?
So for me, the way I think about racial trauma, I think about it as the psychological, emotional, and relational impact that systemic racism has had on individuals and families for generations. For example, recently I was talking with someone, and he is very rigid with his kids. And we were talking, I said, you know, that comes from slavery, right? And so we were talking about how, he was like, no, I don't understand. And so we were talking about how slaves would teach their children to be still and stay in line, because if they didn't, they would get killed. And so then that is passed down from generation to generation. And now Black people are telling their kids to do the same thing around police officers. Be still, obey, be quiet. But so the benefit of that is their intended goal is to protect them and to keep them safe. The unintended consequence is they're not teaching them how to have a voice and how to speak up. And they're unintentionally silencing them in moments that can be hurtful to them. So being able to see and track for people the ways in which slavery and oppression and systemic racism impacts our daily lives is extremely important.
Absolutely, absolutely. And to add on to that, I think about trauma, like when I say it in the most simplest terms for maybe my adolescent clients or my younger clients, I think about it in terms of you've experienced something that shifted how you move, right? Like you've experienced something that shifted how you think, and in a way that you're not comfortable with, and in a way that you're not happy with. And so what that looks like in the sessions is really addressing racial toning, right? Like when somebody tells you that they exhibited a microaggression, and then they are upset with you because you got angry, and they want to now talk about the feeling as opposed to what they did that was inappropriate, right? Or when we talk about this idea of professionalism, that's really rooted in white standard, right? Like you have to dress this way, which usually lacks some sort of creativity, but you have to dress this way because that's what's professional. And you have to wear your hair this way, and you have to shave your beard this way. And all of that is in contrast to what we naturally feel in our soul. And so those are symptoms of racial trauma too, that we often don't get to speak about, right? We don't often get to speak about how even going to work, and not that anybody has said anything to us at work, but when we read the dress code, we knew that there was something about us that wasn't allowed to be there, right? Like whether it was whether we could wear our head wraps or whether we could wear our symbols of empowerment. I also think about it in terms of the fact that it's hard to always address racial trauma when you're still getting hurt, right? Like it's as if you have this cut on your arm and you're trying to heal it, but then it keeps getting cut every night, right? It's hard to fix that. And so we spend a lot of time thinking about that and other ways too. And sometimes it's just, again, a matter of giving space for people to talk because they don't know where else they can talk or who else they can talk to. They don't want to be engaged in debate. Even if they're talking to other Black people, they don't want to get engaged with like an intellectual debate around it. They just want to let it out. They just want to be free. And that's where the therapy serves for them. That's where it serves for all of us. You know, in this particular climate, every one of my clients have talked about how they feel. Every one of them has talked about how it reminds them of childhood experiences or how it reminds them of stories that their parents have told them and stories that their grandparents have told them. And then the frustration that here we are in 2020 and still living this again, right? Like it's still living this on a day-to-day basis. And so there's this complexity in terms of what does racial trauma look like, but also what does healing look like while we're still in the midst of getting hurt. I got excited again.
No, that was awesome. That was awesome. And I agree with everything stated. And I also think there's something to be said about as we navigate within systems, right? Even seeing our brother, our sister go through whatever trauma or humiliation or being stressed day in and day out, month in and month out, year in and year out, and often having to defend themselves. I like how you said, you know, getting into this intellectual debate where they need to express themselves. They need to be heard. They need to be empowered, right? So I didn't get to say this on this talk, but I'm a father of 3 children, and my youngest child is a daughter, right? And so as I really begin to conceptualize, like, what will her life look like being an African-American child being raised in the city of Pittsburgh, right? And my mother was raised here too. And so I tell people all the time, I kind of joke and say, you know, I think my mother would have been a great lawyer. I think she wanted to be a lawyer. She's a Pitt alum, but she graduated with a degree in Africana Studies. And so maybe had she been in DC, maybe there would have been systems, tracks, and opportunities that would have been created for her. And so for me, I want my daughter to be able to be a lawyer if that's what she wants to do. And similarly, seeing my coworkers who maybe, I won't say get put in their place, but are stressed, I'll say it like that. It's tough for me at times, again, because we're working in these systems. It's an overarching system, truth be told, but trying to make sure folks are empowered, I believe, is important in that.
What I do is take a broad view of racial trauma, and I do it in terms of looking at whatever issues I deal with, especially with Black folks, is what's it like to live in a race-conscious culture? So for me, it's always present. It may not be obvious, but it's there somehow. When you look at 400 years of living on this continent and how this culture was constructed early on, that folks from Europe who identify as white set the ground rules and transformed this continent through homicide, genocide, lynching, raping, all those kinds of dynamics in the context of race. So I keep that in mind at all times. So that's where the primary focus of my work is, to help us understand this. And I do it through understanding history, to be able to connect the dots between the present and the past. Because a lot of the issues that show up in therapy are the result of some trauma in the past showing up in the present. However, we don't always recognize the connection between the current symptoms and the past lived experiences that we've had. So I keep that in mind at all times. You know, I've learned to appreciate history. I didn't appreciate it when I was in school. I just thought it was a series of dates and wars and people marrying off their wives and daughters to get more land and power. So, and I started understanding group process and started understanding how the history puts a process in motion that continues from generation to generation, even though it's not connected to how it started. So I keep that in mind at all times. You know, I think Dr. Clark talked about how multi-generational behaviors happen. You know, my hunch is all this corporal punishment And the whoopings we give to our kids are a result of past enslavement practices, of physically beating us and raping us and harming us and punishing us. You know, those of you who are familiar with the Willie Lynch letter, you may see a good example how that's described. Some people say it's not real. If you read it, you will see the symptoms playing out. So I keep that in mind at all times. And we've got to learn how to understand how we're perpetuating something that was part of our past, and we don't realize where it started and how it continues. So it's about healing and understanding how we connect the dots in order to bring about the healing. Because if we don't know something going on, we can't change what we don't know, or what we don't recognize. So that's an extremely important part of doing therapeutic work. And it takes vulnerability to own the painful parts of our past and of our present experiences and our feelings.
That makes me think of the work done by Dr. Joy DeGrow, where she's talking about that post-traumatic slave disorder, right? And how it's showing up in our lives in so many different ways that we don't even pay attention to it. I think about myself as a faculty member who helps in teaching diagnosis. And of course, many of my students at Johns Hopkins are white students, but I'm helping them to understand that they need to think about other considerations when they're thinking about diagnosis in our Black communities, right? In our brown communities. People are quick to say that we have anxiety or we have depression or that we have, bipolar disorder or things of that nature, and not exploring the fact that trauma is probably at the root of that. And it doesn't necessarily have to be something that the average person considers trauma. It doesn't have to be that you were, raped on the street. It could be very much that you got caught up, your family got caught up in a system, and subsequently there was some separation that took place there, right? And you ended up living with a family member that you didn't want to live with because you really wanted to be with your mom, but she got caught up in a social work system. You know what I mean? I saw an article recently, a post that said something like, what do Black people trust social workers? And I'm a counselor by trade, and I appreciate all mental health providers. But I told that person, in my community growing up in South Central Los Angeles and in the Inland Empire of California, the social workers were sometimes just as bad as the counselors, right? Or excuse me, just as bad as the police officers, because they got information and subsequently used that information against us at times where we thought they were helping professionals, they weren't. And so it makes sense to why some people are even more apprehensive about coming to counseling because they don't know how that information is going to be used against them, right? They don't know if we're going to actually keep this information confidential, if it is actually private, or if we're going to release that information to an employer or to a spouse or to someone who is going to hurt them. But when I go back and I think about trauma and how trauma is playing out, sometimes it's just a matter of helping clients increase their awareness, whether it's through education, like Dr. Clark said, in terms of this is a reflection of a generational traumatic experience. This is generational learned behavior. Your family has taught you to cause trauma to other people. So let's unlearn this. Or whether it's through research and history, like Dr. Logan, whether it's through the future and the awareness, like Mr. Phillips, we are responsible for making all that come together for our clients. And sometimes all we need them to do is sit in front of us, And I love the work you're doing, Julius, because this helps normalize what counseling looks like. We are counselors. When clients are seeing this, they're seeing regular people with vibrant personalities, right? They're not seeing the Freudian type of counselor. They're seeing people that look like them, that feel like them, that are passionate with them. And to all those people who are contemplating counseling, I'm saying, come and just sit with us. We're going to be here. We're going to protect you, right? We're going to help you unlearn certain behaviors. We're going to help you be who you want to be. And some of it is nasty and it gets messy, but we're going to guide you through that process. Why? Because it's part of our purpose and because we're here to help, right? And because we love you enough to be here and to sit with you in those moments. And so whether it's related to post-traumatic slave disorder, or whether it's related to systems that have been designed to keep us down, or whether it's related to our family who's accidentally taught us inappropriate behaviors or maladaptive behaviors, this is now the time to unlearn that. And the revolution, in my mind, starts in the counseling room, right? It does not have to just be on TV. It starts when you decide that you're ready to change yourself, when you're ready to break a cycle, when you're ready to show your children and your nieces and your nephews that there's other possibilities in this world. And that sometimes starts with sitting right down in front of a counselor, just like the ones that you see right here. Again, sorry, Julius, I get Y'all, I get so excited now.
Keep going, because I want to join you in that process. You said some very important things. Unlearn certain behaviors.
Yes.
You talk about, getting some mental health treatment, whatever the jargon of therapy, mental health. Some people say, I'm not crazy. It's not about being crazy. It's about how you learn to take care of yourself based on your lived experiences. So you're doing the best you can because we're designed to survive. If whatever your behaviors are that you don't like or you want to change or get rid of, it's because you're suffering. You're in pain about something. So it's not that you're crazy. Your mind, body, mind hyphen body, they're not separate. The mind and body are not separate. They're connected. So your mind hyphen body are reacting to what you experience. You may not consciously know what that is, but your symptomatic behavior that you have, say you have rage. There's a reason you feel rage. So it's important to understand, what is that rage about? What's the meaning of that rage? What purpose does it serve? And how do you view yourself? What's the nature of yourself, the nature of your relationships you've been in, the nature of the world that contribute to that rage? So it's not about being crazy. It's about, we're in survival mode and we learn to adapt to what we've experienced. So change it from I'm ill or mentally ill. I've been making adaptations, and some of my adaptations were not useful. So that's the way I help people try to understand what we're going through. Because this culture always tries to denigrate us. They were less than. So if you put the mentally ill label on us, there's another less than label that we have the burden of carrying and trying to get rid of.
I was going to say real quick that some of it is that it used to be useful, but it no longer serves us, right? That some of the things that we've lived through, we had to make those adjustments and we had to make those adaptations, because that, like you said, Dr. Logan, that was a matter of survival. We had to do that for us to live. Like when you spoke a second ago, we come from 400 years of enslavement. In order to do that, they had to make sacrifices that made sense at that time, but don't make sense today. Whether it comes down to how we whip and spank our children, right? We even call it a beating. Oh, if you keep it up, you're going to get a beating tonight. We still call it that. And it made sense in slavery. And we can't be upset with our ancestors who made that decision, because they made it because they wanted their child to live, right? Like, if I beat you, then the master won't beat you. And if I beat you, then I could love you right afterwards, and I could tell you that you're still great and you're still wonderful. And it made sense at that time, but it doesn't make sense now, because we are still getting hurt. Yes, we are still being marginalized and disenfranchised and things like that. But that level of beating doesn't make sense. We have to learn how to evolve in certain ways. And it's hard to evolve when your limbic system is always activated. And your limbic system and your brain is always activated because you're constantly in survival mode, right? And so it's important that we teach our clients that information. You know, when they say, I want to change and I want to do something else, but I don't know why I'm stuck. Well, let me tell you, let's talk about your limbic system. Let's talk about your amygdala. Let's talk about your frontal cortex. Let's talk about how all of those neurological systems are playing a role in your mind, in connection and intersected with learned behaviors you had. Now that you know it, let's deconstruct it and let's do it well, right? Because it made sense at the time, but it doesn't always make sense now.
Right. As you all are talking, it's reminding me of a conversation I had with someone to make this continue to make this more tangible. With so when all this George Floyd stuff, murder happened, I was talking to an older family member of mine, and we were talking, and she said something that I didn't understand, I didn't get initially. But what I noticed was that she was taking care of white people. And then I thought, wow. So first I was thinking, okay, this is how you have learned how to exist and survive. You were born in the 1930s. And so this is how you learn how to survive. You learn how to survive by protecting and taking care of white people, taking care of their feelings mainly. And you taught me that. So then I had to think about, okay, this is generational again. Again, systemic racism is generational. So how did I learn that? So then I had started to slow down and reflect and think about the ways that I have been taking care of white people that have really been eye-opening to me and transformative to me. And now I've been teaching people not to do that and what that looks like. And I've been teaching white people, hey, when this happens, you need to call it out. You need to talk about it. You need to figure out what's going on, because we have been we have so much internalized racism. We don't always recognize that we're doing it. We don't always recognize how we're taking care of white folks. So this is an example, a really personal example of how generational racial trauma impacts people today.
That made me think, I'm going to say one thing and then I'm going to relax, right? But it also made me think about how it creeps into our lives in ways we don't even pay attention. You know, I'm the only woman on here with us today, right? But I think about how women tell other women as children, right? Watch what you're wearing. And I found myself doing it too. To Brandon's point, I have two children. One of my oldest is a 16-year-old daughter. And I remember when she started to grow into who she is as an adolescent, and I would say, don't wear that, don't do that, because that's bringing too much attention. And then I had to sit back and think, why was I so afraid, right? And it's because as soon as a Black girl got to developing, right, Massa was coming for her. Where's she at? What she look like? Is it time for her to get sold off? Is it time for me to do whatever I need to do? Is she more profitable now, right? But when you hide and you wear these big clothes and you do all that, then you keep your child a child for a bit longer. And that is part of that generational trauma that we don't pay attention to. We want to hide who they are. But then what is the lesson that we teach our girls when we do that? We subsequently teach them not to be proud of their bodies. We subsequently teach them to hide parts of who they are. And that shows up in other ways. It shows up in their relationship with themselves and their eating. It shows up in their relationship with themselves and their self-care and their exercise. It shows up in how they interact with their significant others. It shows up in what they show off too much because they're trying to rebel, or what they don't show off enough, and subsequently they find themselves hiding. And that's all, you know, I even found myself, as woke as I like to think that I am, I even found that I was doing this. I was perpetuating these same traumas to my daughter. And luckily, she's probably more woke than I am. And she said to me, Mom, what's this about, right? Like, I can't hide this, because what I told her at a different time is your body is a creation of God, and it's part of the purpose for you on this earth. Being 6 feet tall, God wanted you to stand out. But then at other points, I'm telling her to hide. Like, that didn't make sense. I was contradicting myself. And I had to sit and figure out, why did I do that? And that's something that we as women constantly are facing and experiencing. And I'm sure as men, you guys have your own experiences too. Trauma that's been passed down from one man to another, whether it has to do with crying, or whether it looks like what masculinity looks like, or whether what protection or providing looks like, right? And we have to be mindful that we all at some point do it, but we can all change it too, right? Like, we don't have to keep that cycle going on. We can be the ones to break that cycle.
Right. Well, I appreciate, Dr. Plummer, what you're talking about is that you had the difficult conversations. Too many times we opt out of having difficult conversations. I am talking to my clients every day. It is mind-blowing how many Black clients, couples that I have, who have not talked to their kids about what's going on in the streets. And it's because they don't know how. They don't know if it's going to upset them. And so we're having a lot of conversations about how to have difficult dialogues about things that impact them, impact their worth, their value, how they're being seen. So we have to have the courage to have the difficult conversation. And I applaud you for doing that.
Yeah, I'd like to circle back for a minute, because I feel like the conversation for me now has just come full circle. Initially, we started out talking about ourselves, right? And so I just thought of an African concept of self that I learned from Naeem Akbar, right? And he breaks it down where he talks about the tribal aspect of who we are, our social aspect, our personal aspect, physical aspect, and at the core is the soul, right? And so I think Dr. Logan said in some cultures, you know, all of those aren't going to be honored, all of those aren't going to be acknowledged. But for us, if we're going to talk about, you know, our African concept of self, we got to look at our soul. And so when you start to think about someone, Dr. Plummer, someone being tall, the creator meant for them to stand out in some regard, right? So your daughter, she could be the first president. female president. I'm gonna put it out there. Who knows, right? For sure.
Thank you. And when she runs for office, I'll be sure to let Julius know so we can pass all the information around. Make sure y'all vote for her. Okay. We'll also be asking for sponsorship. Thank you.
I want to build on the last three exchanges. One of the challenges is that a lot of what we're doing and behaving and acting out is subconscious. We're not even aware it's there. And I'll roll the clock back a little bit, even before childhood, and we can speak and have cognitive intelligence. When we're infants, we don't have words to understand what's happening to us. So all the interactions we have with our parents or caregivers is experiential. We have emotional and physiological experiences. We can't make sense of what's happening to us. So it's lodged in our bodies. A lot of traumas, most of trauma is lodged physiologically. So if you don't know what that feeling means in your body, how can you process it? And that's happening, it gets formed in the attachment process, how our caregivers or parents interact with us. For example, if they're nurturing and warm and caring and responsive to us, we learn to trust them. We learn to trust ourselves and say, I'm a valued being here. Even though we don't have words, we have the experience of being valued. So that's how our first pattern or blueprint of relationships gets formed with our parents and caregivers. If on the other hand, you have a parent who hurts you, wounds you, doesn't respond to you, doesn't feed you, you feel hurt. If they hit you physically, or if they neglect you, don't respond to you, you form a different set of patterns internally, physiologically, and emotionally about people and relationships. The difficulty is we don't know those programs are inside of us. And as we get older, we develop a pattern related to how I learned to take care of myself as an infant that's non-conscious. So that's the challenge and the dilemma of doing therapeutic work and healing ourselves. We got to understand how that plays out. And the importance of having a healer with you is they can see things that you can't see. I get someone who reflects back to me and say, are you aware of this pattern relates to this? And what you're acting out is in the present is somehow related. If you can go back to when your first memory of experiencing this kind of dynamic in a relationship, when was that? And that could be a starting point for beginning some deeper therapeutic work.
Yeah, a few words that you said are sort of standing out to me. One word is healing. And so oftentimes I'll have conversation with Julius about like, what does it mean to heal? What does it mean for pharmaceutical companies? What does it mean for us to continue to engage in therapy, right? I think it means a lot. I think, we talked about folks getting various diagnoses, bipolar, all these things, when in reality, one of the things I had to do when I began to work in therapy is like really understand a trauma-informed lens, which is what happened to a person, right? And not what's wrong with you. And so if everyone could sort of shift that paradigm, everyone from our public servants, right? Our police officers, firefighters, everyone who serves people, if they could begin to assess what happened or even try to understand what happened, I believe the results we would get would be a lot different. And then the whole idea and premise of healing, it would be this ongoing process, I believe, and I would envision that folks would want to share it more readily than they do right now, meaning people may be more inclined to say, hey, Dr. Plummer is my therapist. I go to her once a week, and she's helped me grow in so many ways. I'm now doing something amazing.
Absolutely. I thought about what Dr. Logan was saying a second ago about what we learn as babies, right? And that goes back to this concept that we've all learned in school around attachment theory, right? Like attachment theory as a very Western concept. And in fact, most of our theories are these Western concepts that came from Europe, right? And it's always interesting to think about as Black therapists, as Black mental health providers, doing that additional research, doing that additional work, because if we only take adherence to the theories that we were taught in graduate school, we forget that there were theories of being and theories mental health and theories of healing that was taking place all over the world. Politically, those particular theories were allowed to be published, right? Whether it was because of language or because it was white men or because of how they produced research. But when we continue to go and do our own research, we see that our people were healing themselves in their own unique ways, and it didn't have anything to do with Freud or Erickson or Rogers or Beck, right? It had to do with whomever was in that area, whoever was in that village, whoever was in that community. And in terms of attachment theory, again, that's what got researched, that's what got publicized. But as Black people in our soul, we know how to take care of our offspring. We don't need somebody to tell us that. We know how to do it. It's a matter of reconnecting with ourselves. It's a matter of sifting through some of those old traumas. It's a matter of unlearning certain things, so that we can do what we have naturally been told to do. I'm a person who believes that we are of the first people on this earth, right? Like, we are the original thinkers. We are the original beings. We know how to do this work. And then we come to therapy to go through some of that sifting, to go through some of that muck, to get back to the essence of who we truly are. And to celebrate life in different unique ways, because we are the first, because we have the original blueprint in ourselves, it's our responsibility to continue to do the work to heal, to allow that to shine, right? And right now we've been socialized and oppressed to believe that we are other, but we are not, right? And so it's important that our people that are hearing us and that are coming to counseling gets reconnected with their souls. And when they find a counselor who wants that reconnection with them and who wants to help them, the work is a lot easier. And again, we get afraid of talking about certain details, but sometimes we don't even have to talk about the details right away. Sometimes it's a matter of just helping you identify who you are and who you want to be and creating a path to get there. And that's what therapy is. Like somebody said, it's not always about, fixing what is crazy. Sometimes it's a matter of just purifying yourself. Sometimes it's just a matter of learning how to shine again, and doing it in a way that's beautiful and that doesn't hurt anybody else. We don't have to oppress anybody to rise to the top because we're already at the top. I feel like a pastor.
Well, keep preaching. I'll join you. Since you talked about our ancient origins, when I look at individualistic versus collective culture, that relational support, relationships are the core of all of this, I think. That's my bias. It's about our relationships. If I'm living in a community where the relationships I have are warm and nurturing and caring and protective, I can grow to be a, quote, as Westerners say, a healthy being or an attuned being with myself. I mean, that's part of the dilemma, because one of the questions I wrestle with, how do I become a healthy being, a being who exhibits well-being in the context of a unhealthy culture? And that goes back to the first question: how do you define health in terms of race or well-being in terms of race? Every day we get a message that we don't belong here, we're not deserving, you're less than, you're non-human, you're only good for your physicality. We don't believe in your intellectual capacities or your spiritual capacity. So, we can treat you any way we want in terms of how this culture was established. When you look at the speeches given by the Vice President of the Confederacy and the one, also the message handed down by the Dred Scott decision, that white folks have no need to respect the rights of Black folks. And our goal, the cornerstone speech given by the Confederacy, our job is to keep Blacks subjugated. And we don't understand how that gets inside us living in this culture. So we've got to be aware of who's around us. What kind of relationships do we have? Are they nurturing and caring and supportive? And do we have those relationships that you referred to, Dr. Plummer, also allow us to attune to our spiritual beingness? That's a core and fundamental part of who we are. So, I mean, there's so many dimensions to this, and my education in this culture has been according to, Western ideas. I've, worked with an African shaman and healer for some time because I wanted to understand that part of me. The dilemma is, how do you join the two? Because to be frank, there are some folks who don't identify with their African identity or African heritage, as sad as that may be and painful as that is. But, we all have our lived experiences, and we make sense of the world the best way we can. So I'm not putting that down. I'm just talking about how we've been individually and collectively conditioned to view ourselves a certain way. So that's one of the dilemmas. And also, for a heads up for our audience, there's an additional part of this that's passed on intergenerationally, and it has to do with epigenetics. It has to do with how our environment and our lived experience turns genes on and off. And I can't get into that right now because that's going to take us to another 2 hours. I just want to drop some seeds for folks to research. Look up epigenetics. An example of how something may happen to you. For example, there have been some studies from Holland about the Dutch people. They went through a period of starvation. And people who have diabetes, that may be related to the diet of your grandfather. It may skip a generation, but show up in the next generation in the sons. But that's something for you to look up after this goes off. So I just plant that seed, how complex our well-being is.
So I want to make sure we have each of you has time to answer this final question because I know it's important. So we're in this double pandemic, right? With police brutality and with COVID-19. And specific to Black and brown folks, we know how that is impacting us. It's impacted with pre-existing conditions, with, our kids want to go outside, but we're telling them to stay inside, and they want to go out and play and have fun and be around their friends. And then as caregivers and as adults, we're not sure how to show up, and we're losing our jobs and trying to fight through this double pandemic. And there are a lot of people who are just struggling to find some semblance of hope, particularly Black and brown people, because it's just like, oh, and now also we see Black Lives Matter everywhere. Everyone is now a part of the Black Lives Matter movement. And what's also happening while we're trying to balance COVID and we're trying to balance seeing police brutality in a different form, because the way that George Floyd was murdered, it was different. It wasn't the thing that where we become desensitized to and seeing the gunshot. We saw a human being lay their body weight on another human being, and we're watching it and we're thinking, he's not going to do that. He's going to get off of this human being. He's going to get off of him. You know what? Oh, he's not going to get off of him. Surely somebody watching is going to help. Somebody watching is going to come in and they're going to help this man. Neither one of those things happen. So the trauma from seeing George Floyd's murder, from COVID-19, and now the Black Lives Matter movement and everybody that's involved in that, there's also a lot of labor being asked of Black people. Teach us, show us the way, tell us how to honor the humanity of Black people. Tell me how to love you, Black people. COVID and all this racial trauma, how do we give Black and brown people hope in trying to balance and manage all that?
That's a heavy question to answer. There are so many aspects to that. First of all, Dr. Clark and I were talking about, not only are we expected to assist other people in their healing and well-being process, as individuals, we got our own life issues as well. So we've got to sort out our stuff so we are clearer when we form a relationship with another person. That's one of the things. What I've learned to do is understand what's important in terms of relationships. Who am I emotionally closest with? How vulnerable am I with them to have an authentic relationship so we can really talk about how we're feeling, how we're thinking about ourselves, how we're thinking about relationships, how we're thinking about how we can work together in unity to support, be empathic, and bring our presence so our full attention is on what's going on in that relationship in a way that is responsive and attuned. So we're not trying to create an answer while the other person's talking. We're really listening and attuned so they can feel felt. Do you feel me when I'm talking to you? That's an important cornerstone of the healing process. And there's a whole process to go through that, but that's one of the things that I've learned to do is when I'm sitting here with my partner, we spend each morning talking about how we're feeling about things. And we made a promise to each other that we won't let 24 hours go by without us addressing some issue that comes up between us. Because if you're in an intimate relationship or in a family relationship, there's always some friction going on. You can't escape that. That's the nature of relationships. It's about dealing with the friction in the relationship in a way that's safe and empathetic. And that's a skill that can be learned. How do you be there for someone? And how do you experience them being there for you? So that's a real short answer to your question. And the more people you have in your circle that you can do that with, the studies show the healthier you can be.
I guess I would just dovetail on what Dr. Logan is saying. One is absolutely for me, surrounding myself with people that pour into me, that see me, that value me, that see my worth. Self-care to me is about replenishment, not distraction. So what am I doing to replenish myself? What am I doing that feeds me? One of the things, in addition to surrounding myself with people that value me, another thing is trying to be still. Like just just slow down, be still. And I'm trying to work hard at that. I'm not the best at being still. I have like a million things going on all at the same time. But one of the things I'm trying to do a much better job at is to just be. The other thing I would add to that is connecting with nature and the earth is huge for me. It gives me a space of peace and calmness, and connecting to the earth is grounding for me. So those are huge things for me that really help me heal and get clear and get at peace.
Julius, I sat here and I was thinking about that, and like Dr. Logan said, that's such a heavy question, right? And I know that's why we're here. I know that's why you invited us and you put us all together. Our synergy on this panel is so real, right? I think when you say those things, when you made those questions and comments, it made me think about the fact that we're experiencing so much loss and grief, especially in general, but especially related to George Floyd. What we saw was a live lynching, and that is not of our generation. We have read that in books. We have seen images of it at the Smithsonian. We have seen images of it if we went to HBCUs. It was indoctrinated in us. We understand what it is, but this was our first time watching a lynching happen. And what that did was take us to a whole nother level of shock. We know about death. We know that they happen at the hands of many police officers, many bad police officers, but we have not had to see it, right? Like we see the arrest and then all of a sudden they're not there anymore, right? But we don't see when the people take their last breath, And so what happens while we're already in the middle of this pandemic, which, you and I had a chance to talk about last month, we're already in this pandemic. So our limbic system is already activated because it thinks we're in survival mode, right? Because we are in a physical survival mode. And in that survival mode, we then watch a death happen. It took our brains to a place that we just have not been ready for, that we are not accustomed to. Could our ancestors have watched that and then been able to do something later? Quite possibly, because it was probably more a part of their reality than it was for us. And so I think what's happening is that we're experiencing more loss, and and not just loss, tangible loss, but we're experiencing the loss of dreams. We're experiencing the loss of security. We're experiencing the loss of things that are immeasurable, right? We're experiencing the loss of, can we protect our children? We're experiencing the loss of, can we protect ourselves? And that puts us in a very vulnerable place. And it causes a lot of dissonance when we like to think that we have this power and we have this control. So I think we have experienced all this loss, and subsequently, we're not really processing the grief, right? We're skipping over the grief and we're going right into the action and not spending time with some of the emotion that's there. So I think it's important for us to acknowledge the loss and not just the loss of life, because that's important, but the loss of all those other things. And then to also acknowledge the grief that we're experiencing in those moments, to spend some time with the shock factor, right? To spend some time acknowledging the shock and subsequently the fear that comes out of that. So although we want to hurry up and get to hope, sometimes we have to sit with that ugly emotion. Sometimes we have to sit with what's uncomfortable before we can even move forward to hope. As we think about hope, that's really set in that amygdala, right? Like that's where we're getting a lot of these emotions from. But when that back part of our limbic system is activated because of our senses, it's difficult to even get into that amygdala, right? So one of the things that I think we need to do if we're making this more tangible, because like Dr. Logan said, there's all this other stuff, right? There's the epigenetics, there's the limbic system, there's all this neurological stuff and physiological stuff. But if we make it tangible, I think what we need to do as we are aiming to have hope is to really put boundaries on what we're sensing. You know how we were in elementary school and we had those 5 senses, what you see, what you touch, what you taste, what you hear, what you smell. Our limbic system is activated based off of our senses. And we need to really monitor what we are seeing and what we're hearing. It doesn't mean that it doesn't exist, nor does it mean that we're in denial. It means that at some point we need to just, like Dr. Clark said, sit still, and then we need to protect that part of our brain. Because once we protect that part of our brain, then we can move forward into that other part of our brain, which is where our hope is set in. And then we can talk about what behaviors come out of that hope. But the first thing we need to do is protect our brain, protect what we're seeing, protect what we're hearing. You know, we get this idea that we have to watch Facebook all the time and watch the news and things like that, but that's actually not helpful for us. As we continue to go into some tangible things, I think it's important for us to always get reconnected with our pastime experiences. Get back into the things that we found joy. Watch those cartoons. I'll be 40 later this year, and I'm still coloring in my coloring book with Mickey Mouse and Minnie Mouse and all that kind of stuff, right? Because that brings me joy, and that's nostalgic for me. It's playing cards, and well, depending on what neighborhood you came play, never mind, that's a whole nother conversation, right? So, but playing cards and like Uno and things like that, or playing jacks and watching cartoons and doing the things that made us feel good when we were a child. We're not too old to do those things because they were nostalgic. They brought joy for us and brought joy to us. And then lastly, living authentically. Stop feeling like we have to switch all the time. Like, who we are is enough, and showing up in those ways, right? And not trying to feel like we have to impress somebody or we have to control the situation in certain ways. So in terms of how do we get back to that hope, I think we acknowledge the loss, we acknowledge the grief, we acknowledge the shock and the fear. We limit what our senses are being exposed to. We have tangible replacement behaviors like our pastimes, and then we live in a very authentic way. Thank you.
Thank you.
I concur with everything that has been said. I really feel like there's not much to add. One thing I will add, though, is affirmations, positive affirmations. It could be something as simple as a poem, or it could be an affirmation, that one states daily.
Let me add some other ways of addressing some of the issues we're dealing with. For those people who are not able to establish a relationship up close and personal, especially when we're so isolated, if you don't have someone with whom you can communicate those deeper level issues, there are certain things you can also do, like Dr. Clark talked about being still. What they're calling mindfulness now, they used to call meditation. If you can do mindfulness practices, that will calm you. Now, it's not for everybody, because sometimes getting quiet will activate some of those traumas that have been laying dormant. So you got to be careful if it works for you. If it doesn't, I earlier talked about trauma being physiologically located. What we can do, there's a process based on what's called energy psychology. And it comes from the East based on acupuncture, where you take your fingertips and you tap certain acupuncture points on your body. What that does, it changes how the circuits respond to how emotions are transmitted throughout your body. And it cuts them off. Each emotion has its own particular molecule. So when you tap, you change the neurochemical transmission of feelings in your body, and it can actually tone it down. There's also a therapeutic process based on constructionism. It's how we all construct our own reality, quote, reality in quotes, and our view of it, how we make sense of it. And there are 4 dimensions of how we know things, but we're not conscious that we know them. There's a way to surface those and make sense of how the things you're going through make sense, but you got to go to the appropriate level to find out how it makes sense for you. So that's the short version, because what we're doing, we can't change what we don't know. So the thing is surface our inner knowings that are, like we said earlier, I think Dr. Plummer talked about that, adaptions we make. So how do we learn about the adaptions that are non-conscious and surface those to know that we are acting out behaviors because we're trying to avoid a suffering, a deeper level of suffering. So sometimes the sufferings at the conscious level, the symptoms that you want to get rid of, are more tolerable suffering than the suffering you have not been able to confront. But that takes a certain process to do. So I can't give that to you in 5 minutes. But there are more ways that you can work on it. There's also a process called focusing. You can do your individual attunement to tune into what your body's communicating to you. Now that process saved me when I was going through a divorce when I was in my early 20s. I did focusing when I walked down the street, when I waited for a streetcar, when we had streetcars. But it's a process of surfacing. So it tells you how old I am. But it's a way of tuning into ourselves when we don't have anyone else to tune into. So those are some concrete ways. And if you look up these terms that I'm throwing out at you, that'll start you on your path to your individual healing if you don't have a relationships in which you can do healing in.
Absolutely. I wanted to add in something real quick too, if I could, Dr. Logan, around relationships, because we've been talking a lot about individuals and how we need to do our individual work, which is absolutely 100% important. I also recognize that in the midst of COVID, we are oftentimes at home with our significant others, or we're at home with our children and things like that. And I think it's important that as Black people, we understand what our partners and our children and what our family members are going through also, because it's important to recognize that everybody is having their own healing process and their own separation process, right? And their own cleansing process. And that all of that is compounded right now as we're in the middle of COVID. And we have to look at and see each other on those kind of deeper and more intimate levels. And so this is really a time for, especially as parents, for us to do the work, because we're spending more time at home with our children, right? And so we're able to see the product of what we're creating as well. So I absolutely agree in mindfulness and prayer and meditation and things like that. There's an app that's specific for mindfulness for Black people called Liberate. And it's a beautiful app, and it connects us to all these ancestral powers, but it also connects us to the sense of soul. And sometimes these meditations, these guided meditations are not talking about those things, right? And there's something important to be connected to us as Black people and who we are and the roots of who we are and why we are here and why we have been chosen from our ancestors to be here right now. And so an app like Liberate, designed by us and for us, I sound like FUBU, right? Designed by us and for us is really what we need to be supporting too, as we're supporting Black business. See, Julius, you came back and I was talking again.
Listen, I pulled up my phone and I said, oh, I can just go away now. They're good. I don't even need to be here. Final thoughts? Final thoughts?
I guess the only final thought I had was around, I think, Julius, you brought up, or somebody brought up, white folks are wanting us to give them answers. And so I want to combine that with Dr. Plummer talking about boundaries. We can say that's your job. That's not our job. So when we get to start talking to white folks about how they can help and what they can do, we are taking care of them. It's just that subtle. So what we can say is, go and do the work. Go and take care of yourself. That's not my job. So I just want to note that one of the ways that Black folks take care of white folks is doing the work for them. We have to set up boundaries so that we don't do that. I just wanted to note that before we stop.
And to some degree, Dr. Clark, we're told to feel guilty if we don't do it, right? Like, oh, you have all the answers. This is a Black problem and you're Black. So you have the solution. I didn't create this problem. Your people create, just like I go back to my ancestors and try to figure out solutions. You need to figure out who in your line needs to get some fixing, right? And how they cause generational trauma for you too. And how you're showing up in this world like that too. Like, that's your responsibility, like you said, to do the work. And we as Black people don't need to feel guilty because we say no. I had a student email me the other day. She has some microaggressions a previous semester ago. But then we were able to get past it. But she came to me and she said, hey, Dr. Plummer, can you give me some resources around such and such? And I'm still an educator, right? So I said, sure, here's some resources, blah, blah, blah. But let us also talk about how you used your white privilege a couple semesters ago to try to do something that was inappropriate as it came to me. You as a young white student tried to use your privilege to go against something that I said. So as you are wanting to do the research and you want to educate your friends and you want to read the books and now you're watching these movies, look in the mirror because you are part of the problem. And it is my responsibility as your educator to educate you in that you are part of the problem. So what are you going to do about that? Don't be so consumed with telling everybody else what to do. Tell yourself what to do too, right? And I think that we have to be comfortable in our courageous conversations and our difficult conversations to say no and then to hold people accountable when they're doing something that's wrong, especially as we're a couple of days away from Juneteenth. No, this is wrong. And it is in me to have to tell you that this is wrong, but it's not in me to tell you the solution. I'm gonna just highlight for you that it's wrong and you have to do the work to figure it out. And meanwhile, I'm gonna be over here living my life. Thank you.
Let me add to that. Gratefully and hopefully there are white folks doing their work. And every couple of weeks I meet with a group of Black and white folks who are dealing with Black and white issues, frankly and authentically. You know, some of the folks they may want to look at, the older ones are Joe Fagan, Tim Wise, and the newer person, Robin DiAngelo. Those might be places to start if they want to really do their own work, especially Robin DiAngelo. She really lays it out extremely clearly, all the ways white folks defend against owning their own stuff. So that's the best I can offer. But I'm encouraged that there are white folks who are addressing their issues of whiteness. And it really was disorienting at first to see how many white folks were demonstrating. You know, part of me says, I hope this is real and I hope it lasts. So that gives me some hope, at least right now in the present day. Now we'll see how long this plays out. I am encouraged though. That the relationship, that's the bottom line, the relationship among Blacks and whites really has hit a turning point. So that gives me hope. And hopefully all our ancestors will get together and join us in orchestrating how this plays out and spirit guides this whole process. Because frankly, I got upset after the last election and I had to come to terms with, I think his election is a spiritual lesson for this country. He emerged from the culture. He wasn't an accident. And unless folks understand that process and do something about it, you know, sort of some folks are like sitting on the Titanic, hoping it's going to continue to float with him in the office. So, I mean, there's a lot of work to do on everybody's part, individually and collectively. The difficulty is, as Black folks, this trauma comes like waves sitting on an ocean beach. We don't have time to process and heal from and resolve and integrate the previous trauma before another one comes. That's what's making it so difficult to heal. And I think this last incident finally, I'm really puzzled how folks couldn't see what they saw a couple of weeks ago when George Floyd died. I just found it amazing that Roger Goodell said, oh, now we understand what Colin Kaepernick did. Well, I said, well, what didn't you see back then that you finally see now? Help me understand that. So that's part of the process. And one more thing I'll say, and I'll shut up. It's my pain about how centuries of oppression and internalized racism happens with us as Black folks. That's really painful, and that's one of the things I'm working on addressing. Because living in a race-conscious culture, it's almost probably impossible to avoid the enculturation process. We picked up some mindsets coming from white folks, living with them. We're in relationship with white folks. So we've internalized the process. of how we are to be in this culture. Unless we understand how that plays out at a deep level, some of us will perpetuate it. And somehow white folks find those folks. I look at who's on the Supreme Court and I'm going, where do they find him? You know, I found out he came from the Federalist Society. I'm going, oh, that's how they found him. So there are some Black folks who don't like Black folks. I saw a YouTube video the other day with this person looked biracial to me, or looked like she had some Black in her, who said how much she hated niggers. Someone did something to her when she was driving. And she said, I hate niggers. Until we get the niggers and the MFs and bitches and hoes out of our consciousness, we will not be able to heal and transform ourselves. That's a fundamental issue. We have to understand how we internalize living in a race-conscious culture has destroyed and harmed our sense of self and our attempts to attain well-being and health. So the bottom line is, how do we become individually and collectively healthy in an unhealthy culture? Okay, I'm done for tonight. Thank you.
We all said we're done for the night, Julius. You got all of us in here getting us all worked up and passionate and things like that.
Did everybody give a chance to give final thoughts?
You know, to Dr. Logan's last statement, I also feel like we just have to watch what we're consuming, because old saying from, I think, my mother, garbage in, garbage out. And much of what the country wants us to consume is programming. Hence, the term program. You're gonna watch your program tonight. And so we gotta deprogram ourselves, right? Because much of what we're sort of inundated with, for me, is power, right? And I often ask myself, like, so if there wasn't this black and white dynamic, like, what is this based on? And it's power, right? And so even as I, like I sort of started talking about my daughter, I look at like her potential to be her best self and be self-efficacious will be contingent on, her feeling empowered, her being empowered, and also folks around her, educators, educing, bringing out the best in her. And I just use her as an example because as I begin to understand globally, it's like a woman is a minority. And so how do I make sure, like, my daughter will be like a double minority, that, she's empowered, uplifted, and supported on her journey in this lifetime. So
I don't think thank you suffices to each of you, right? Y'all are living in the midst of this double, triple, quadruple pandemic, all that's going on, and you're still giving out, sharing your energy. That's a lot of labor, that's a lot of effort, and I've received it. So I hope that the folks watching have received it. And I gotta find my camera. So if you sat and you watched this and you're not holding yourself accountable, you missed the point. It's not, what are they doing over there? What are they doing over there? No, what are you doing? I'm asking myself that question. What am I doing? What are you doing? These four phenomenal human beings just opened up a part of their soul to share this information, this wealth of centuries of knowledge and pain and power. So now you have to do something with it. I'm gonna hold myself accountable, and they're already doing the work. So hold yourself accountable.
Julius, I think you muted yourself at the very end.
What was the last thing you heard?
Hold yourself accountable.
And then I said, I love y'all and have a great evening.
And we needed to hear that last part too, Julius. So of course,
Yes,
you know that we love
absolutely.
you too.
Yes, thank you so much, Julius.
Appreciate y'all. All right.
All right.
Bye.
Thank you. Appreciate the opportunity to connect with all of you.
Good night, all. Blessings.
Bye.
Ashe.
Yeah.